I'd like to welcome and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I'm Yujin Jang, a doctoral student in the Department of Communication and a senior member of the Colloquium committee. I would like to start first by extending my big welcome to our guests today. We have a lot of faculties and graduate students and a lot of friends in our college. And so thank you for joining us. And those of you watching our live stream, welcome to all of you. We recognize that we have technical issues, so you might not see the exact screen, to see the slide, but we are planning to upload the recorded video right after the talk, and so you can see the recorded video in our channel. Today we have a fundamental scholar in our field, Dr. Cappella, and as our first speaker for the Colloquium series, and Dr. Turner, the chair of the department, which we're introducing.
Thank you, Eugen. I also want to welcome all of you for being here, and whoever is out on our live stream, we'll check that out later, but really excited that we could live stream this for alum and other friends of the department. I am so excited and thrilled that we were finally able to get Dr. Joe Capella out here to Michigan State. After some illness and blizzards and COVID, we finally were able to get you here. We've been working on this for, I think, 4 years, right? So this is long awaited. I'd like to tell you a few things about Dr. Capella. I cannot tell you everything because it would take up all of the time, all right? This scholar has been fundamental to our field, has made amazing contributions to interpersonal communication, persuasive communication, both in the arenas of political and health communication, and is extremely accomplished, one of the most accomplished scholars in our field. Joe got his bachelor's degree from Lemoyne College, which is in Syracuse, in physics. He then went on to Johns Hopkins, where he also studied physics, at which time he realized he would be better off studying communication? Yeah, okay. So he came to Michigan State University in 1970 and received both his master's degree as well as his PhD from this very department. I want to mention to you that his MA and PhD were completed in a total of 4 years. Okay. He then went to the university. Yeah? Oh, that's right. Meanwhile, living in housing on campus with 2 kids and his wife, right?
Man.
Yeah, so that there begins the impressive nature of your career. You, as you know, Joe was at the University of Wisconsin in 1974 and spent, 16 years there, and then went to the University of Pennsylvania in 1990. In 1998, he was named the Gerald R. Miller Professor of Communication, which is a distinguished honor for us because Dr. Miller was Joe's advisor when he was here, and Joe actually requested and even talked to Jerry's wife about being able to adopt that name for his endowed chair. So that's really very cool. So you are now the Gerald R. Miller Professor of Communication Emeritus at Penn. For those of you that are new to our field, our new students, Dr. Capella is an ICA fellow. He's the former president of ICA. He's a former editor of HCR. He's former ICA Fellows Book Award. I mean, I could go on with all the awards. I did a very quick, dirty calculation of all the external funds you've brought in, and I have it at well over $60 million. It's probably more in the 70s, with total direct monies from the likes of the National Cancer Institute, the FDA, National Institute for Drug Abuse, and many, many more. Joe has published 147 journal articles, 4 books, many of which are award-winning, and 51 book chapters, and chaired 50 doctoral dissertations? 51, just to match your chapters. Huh. That's brilliant. So it goes without saying that we're thrilled to have you here, especially since you began your career in communication here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jose Capella.
Thank you, Mo, for that lovely introduction. When you look back at all of those things that I've done, it's a fair inference to conclude that I'm really, really old. And that would be true. It's a real pleasure to be back here on the Michigan State campus where I started my graduate life in communication. And I just wanted to introduce to you some of the people who were especially important to me. In the top row here, Jerry Miller, Jack Hunter, and Don Cushman. Both Jerry and Jack Hunter Jerry Miller and Jack Hunter were co-directors of my dissertation. So I had two people to answer to at that time. And I don't know what to call Don Cushman, but he was in my office every day. And it usually with an article in his hand, which he would hand to me. And he'd say, Capella, you've got to read this. And so, and I say, I'll get to it later. And he said, no. He said, this is really important. You have to read it now. So I would start reading it, and it would go for maybe a minute and a half. And he'd go, never mind. The author makes 3 points. And that's how my days in graduate school, after we fed the babies in the morning, went. It was a great opportunity. Came in under the mentorship, not the mentorship, but the power system with David Berlow when he introduced the knowledge utilization and knowledge creation or generation program. I had the opportunity to work briefly with Av Rogers. Herb Bettinghouse is shown here, and Brad Greenberg. I couldn't find a good picture of Pete Trodal, although I find that there's a painting of him in the Miller Library. Randy Harrison gave me an interest in nonverbal behavior for later in my life, and Heidi Kumada, Joe Woelfel, and the opportunity that I had at Michigan State to go to Wisconsin for a semester and study with 4 of the faculty members there that had a real impact on my interests. And so between Jack, who was a math modeler, and Jerry, who was a persuasion scholar, that gave rise to 2 of my core interests, which have remained to this day. And that is an interest in the way messages work and trying to understand how they work in a formal and logical manner. So I pay homage to these folks and homage to those of you who carry on the message of Michigan State and its interests and values into the field of communication. So what I puzzled long and hard about what to talk about today. I've been at this for a very long time, and so learned a lot, and I called these lessons learned, and I thought that was a little bit arrogant, so I think to put that more in terms of principles of message effects research. I'm going to tell you the principles, and then I'm going to elaborate them a little bit. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about how and why we might want to take messages apart and then try to put them back together. I read a book a long time ago when I first started out as an undergrad, as an assistant professor at Madison, called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Great book, one that had a lot of influence over the way I think about things. And basically the idea is that if you want to understand how to make a motorcycle work a smidgen better, you got to be able to take it apart and put it back together again. So that's lesson or principle number 1. And the second principle that I'm going to elaborate in a bit is the notion that that is an analogy. In all of our research, why don't we just study one person? Why do we keep studying more than one person in our experiments? I mean, why do we do that? And the reason is we don't want to make an inference to one person. Why don't we do the same thing with messages? Why would we study one message? Don't we want to study multiple instances? Don't we want to make inferences to the set of messages from which the conceptual one that we're studying comes? Why don't we study multiple messages? We should, and we have been. That is going to mean that part of what we have to do to study multiple messages is we have to get off of the gold standard for message effects. The gold standard for message effects, which I'll describe in just a minute, is stuff that we all know about. You take one good message, you derive it from theory, you compare it to a no message control group or some kind of control group, you look at the behavioral or cognitive or emotional outcome, you study it over time for a number of people, and then you make an inference to that one message in that one context. And I'm not saying that's not a good standard, but if we're going to study multiple messages, we're going to have to study multiple messages. And so we need some efficient strategies to do that, and the gold standard won't do it, not because it's not right, but because it's terribly inefficient. And then I'll say a couple of quick words with a few more principles. One is, what do we compare our messages to? What kind of control group should we use? That turns out to be a non-trivial question, an incredibly non-trivial question. And sometimes we need more than one control group. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, but quickly in passing. And I'm going to argue against manipulation checks, and I'll let you jump up and down about that as you see fit, but I'll make the most extreme case possible on that. And then finally, I want to talk about creating interventions that can't work because we pay too much attention to mediation that's statistical, circumstantial, and theoretical rather than real. Okay, so let's dig in on each of those questions a bit, hopefully with not too much detail, but enough to keep you interested in the principle and what makes it work. On the Zen question, we started pulling messages apart when we were doing work for NIDA grant work in the time just as the federal government was carrying out an anti-drug program funded post just at the end of the Clinton administration. And one of the things that we were finding in our studies was that all of the interventions that we were studying experimentally were failing. You put out an anti-drug message for drugs of first choice, you put it into the group, and either it would produce no effect or it would produce a boomerang effect. And of course, everybody kept saying to us, the postdocs, my colleagues and everything, this was with Marty Fishman, would always say to us, well, you guys just don't know what you're doing. You got the wrong control group, you got the wrong messages, you're not testing your messages properly, and so you got to stop doing what you're doing, and we'll do the real tests, which is tests in the field, until eventually the careful tests proved by the Office of Management and Budget, run by RTI in the most sophisticated ways possible, produced boomerang effects. So all of our experimental findings produced boomerang effects, and so we said, why? What the heck is going on? Why are these messages not working? And we couldn't figure it out. And so we decided to go to some kind of procedure to take these messages apart and then try to put them back together. And so part of what we did was captured by this slide, and it's sort of transparent in some ways. We tried to extract the core argument, a content feature, either stated because there's text on the screen or there's audio on the screen that produces an argument. And sometimes we would also add information that was present in the visual. And we've listed those arguments for each of the kinds of messages. This was all NIDA-based, all anti-drug argumentation. And we would carry out evaluation processes for each of these arguments. We would rate them. Sometimes we did text analysis. I'm not going to talk about that today. It produced some interesting substantive outcomes, but I'm not going to talk about it. And then we would also code features that were not content features. And we used a wide variety of content features, message sensation value, information introduced from Annie Lang's lab, I-squared so-called. We ended up coding as many as 50 different features. And so when we had an argument that we evaluated, we used an aggregate evaluation of the success of that argument in terms of the judgments of people from the target population. But the features that were format features were ones that were coded. And so they were objective features. So there were some objective features, some subjective features, but the subjective features were always in aggregate. And that's really important for everything else I'm going to tell you here, because otherwise it's going to look like you get a subject evaluating something and then the subject's outcome. We never have that in any of our message work, never under any circumstances, because it produces a different set of results. This is a more complicated slide that essentially says the same thing. It's based on a study by Yaoi Kang done in 2006, and it's about message sensation value as a global set of features broken out into audio and visual content, tested against adolescents, some of whom were high risk for drug use, some were low risk, and then ad evaluation work that was carried out. But what I want to do is to show you the results from that I think were pretty provocative. If you look at message sensation value on all of the participants in the study, so this is not broken out by high and low risk individuals. It looks at perceived effectiveness, and it looks at ad liking and positive and negative thoughts. Positive and negative thoughts being the sort of a gold standard, at least in social psychology. Perceived ad effectiveness was something that we were trying to develop. And if you look across the bottom of the graph, you see you're moving from low argument strength to high argument strength. You should always see from low to high, go up if you've got good arguments. And that certainly is true for those messages that had low sensation value. But for messages that had high sensation value, that wasn't the case. And for any of these outcomes, and guess what? When you looked at the group that you really cared about, which is the high risk group, you don't care so much about the low risk group because you know what? They're not going to use drugs anyway. All right, the high risk group is going to use drugs. And what you have here is a boomerang effect among the high MSV ratings, with the low argument strength working better than the high argument strength for this group of individuals across all three of these kinds of ratings. And so you have the real possibility here that what low risk group, by the way, was behaving differently than the high risk group, consistent with how the low risk group should behave. And they didn't show that same kind of boomerang effect. But the key outcome here was, it looks like high message sensation value was interfering with the strong arguments, especially for the high risk group. And that's the argument that we pushed in that study, and we followed it up in other contexts in the past. And so, for example, one of the ways we followed this up is with some neuro data. So, Cappella, are you sure about this? And it took us a while to get to that point, but we looked at high and low message sensation value from a set of about 99. The previous study was based on 60 messages that were seen and rated separately. I want to go back one step here. The argument strength in these messages is evaluated outside of the group of individuals who is evaluating the effectiveness, liking, and positive and negative thoughts. And we always do that separately if we possibly can, and I'll argue why we do that at a later point in the text. To go back to, do we really know that message sensation value can be an interference and not always an attention-getting component? And we did this with a neuro study with Dan Langleben and a group of other people, Andrew Strasser, Karen Lerman, and some people from Dan's lab. We looked at people who were exposed to either high or low message sensation value ads. They were matched in terms of argument strength, so that argument strength comes out of the equation, and those who were unexposed got a parallel set. So you have a set of ads that people saw that were high and low in message sensation value, and a set that they didn't see that were high and low in sensation value, plus a set of neutral videos. And there was a recall of scenes. Did you see, was the scene present in something that you saw, or was it not present? 128 scenes. So the knowledge measure is, I think, a pretty good measure. We kept track of both the successful scene recognition and successful absence of the scene from the materials that they saw. And there was a testing stage and an imaging stage, as is often the case with MSV, with neuro studies. And what we found was that the correct identification of scenes was more substantial, statistically significant for the low MSV ads, and quicker than was the case for the high MSV ads. And if you look at brain-based work, and brain people in the audience will appreciate these pictures in ways that I cannot. it looks like a bad dinner, but it's in fact activation of the regions of the brain that can be interpreted as suggesting that there is deeper cognitive processing of the low MSV ads than the high MSV ads, suggesting that there's something else going on with the high MSV ads, some kind of distraction process, and other data from these same brain studies also suggesting that the MSV is not producing higher endogenous attention in regions of the brain that matter the most. So we think that that finding, which I don't want to make too big a deal of, but I want to make the point that the only way that we're able to detect this finding was pulling some of the pieces apart. And I won't even tell you about how we pulled apart the video components and the audio components, and some of those are in the article by Yahui Kang. And it gave us some hope that we could carry out this synthesis by analysis approach, and it's something we have used in other contexts, and I will make that clear in just a bit. The only other thing that came out of some of this work is the idea that messages have a content component and a format component. And the way I think about this is we can deliver content in a lot of different ways. And some of those ways include narrative, which sounds like it's a content component, and I would argue it's not. That you can deliver content in a narrative format or in an expository format. Maybe you can't deliver the relationships in the narrative that are often present in such narratives, but the formatting component and the content component can be pulled apart, and that's what we've tried to do in a lot of the work that we've done, just as we've done here, and Yahui did, and the work that she had published in communication monographs. Okay, why don't we study just one person? Part of what analysis by synthesis by analysis requires is that we have a lot of messages and that we evaluate those messages. And so part of what we want to be able to do is to study multiple messages, which means we have to choose them from a larger, more extended set. In the same way that we want to infer to individuals of type X, not to Frank, okay? We don't want to infer to Frank. We want to infer to people like Frank. Maybe not, I take that back. I didn't mean Frank Buster. I don't know why you would even think I was talking about Frank. I'm not talking about Frank Buster. I'm talking about a general archetypal Frank. We don't want to infer to that person in the study. We want to infer to persons like that. And you might say, well, the analogy here with messages is we don't want to infer to the message that was designed as a brochure yesterday about prostate cancer risk and prevention in urban African Americans. We don't want to infer to that. We want to infer to messages like that, which carry risk information and maybe efficacy information, and do a lot of other things as well that are irrelevant to those core constructs. And so we use multiple participants, of course, and we use multiple messages, precisely because we want to infer to people of a certain kind and type in our target population, and messages of a certain kind or type in the message population. So that means that we want to be able to carry out both. So people can be a random variable, but then so can messages be a random variable from which the messages are selected for testing purposes. And the first study that we did, I won't go into any details about this. This idea is not mine. It comes from work by Sally Jackson from a book that she wrote in 1992 called Message Effects Research. And one of my students in 1994, Brian Addig, who was interested in HIV advertising and the knowledge that was being produced from those sometimes very evocative kinds of ads. He had different hypotheses about what high emotion ads might do. And he said, they could activate and motivate interest, and therefore increase the likelihood that people are being attentive. They could also be distracting. They could also carry out retroactive interference. So the question is, what did he end up finding? He ended up finding an inverted U relationship between emotion and knowledge about the text that followed up those ads. But what was key here is not that finding, but rather the fact that he used multiple messages in each of the conditions that he carried out, and used the appropriate statistical methods of nesting and so on to carry out an inference to the messages and to that were behind this outcome. And it was a very nice beginning to our study of multiple messages and the case category confound that's behind them. That's where Shelley Jackson got her idea from, out of psychology, because of the concern with using in the words that were being used to test various kinds of category effects. This was discovered by a lot of people, like right away. Just 25 years later, Dan O'Keefe and Mike Slater and Byron Reeves, and we eventually stuck our nose, put our beak in the in the dessert here. And so there are 4 really well done, important articles about message effects using multiple messages. I invite you to take a look at any and all of these. They're all a little bit different, but they all make the same general argument. So, if we're going to study multiple messages, we got to do it in a way that is more or less efficient. Okay, we can't use the gold standard. Now, some people have tried. So, and I'll be honest about this. People like Dan O'Keefe and others have been pushing. Let's study this message, in this context, and then this other message that's like it in a different context, and use the gold standard and do a meta-analysis. Well, if I can do that with 200 messages, think of how long it's going to take him to do that with those 200 messages. Okay, you might say, well, yeah, but he's going to be generating insights about those messages from each of those studies, and that may be. But we need to be able to find a way to carry out multiple message assessments that's efficient, that's valid, and that will, valid to a degree, because it's not going to replace the gold standard, and that will allow us to triage the high-performing and the low-performing messages, the strong argument messages versus the weak argument messages. MSV and all of those things we can do by hand, and those are objective features. But the subjective features and the overall effectiveness of the message requires that we have an efficient strategy. And I've made the argument in an article in 2018 in Journal of Communication that says, we don't have one way of measuring length. We have many ways of measuring length. Sometimes we can use the most precise, but we shouldn't ever argue that we have to always use the most precise way to measure length. Sometimes we just want to know it's like 1.5 feet, all right? And this other one is 2 inches, and that's good enough, all right, for certain kinds of outcomes, and that's what we did. So what are some of the problems that are created by trying to get at multiple messages? Well, first of all, you got to have multiple messages, right? Where do they come from? You're going to start to create them? You're going to create 100 new messages? No, you probably aren't. But a lot of times we're in a position to have easy access to a lot of messages to be able to evaluate. So for example, in our NIDA work, the anti-drug messages that we had at our disposal were in the hundreds. The work that we've done in tobacco, again, in the hundreds. Tobacco labels that are not PSAs, maybe not thousands, but getting close to it pretty easily. You want social media commentary about the HPV vaccine? Ton of it, there's tons of it. You have access to real world messages in high numbers easily and readily, okay? For some contexts, not all, but for many contexts. And achieving reliability in the evaluation of them is an internal reliability kind of consideration. Efficiency, I'll point out here in just a moment, efficiency means if you have people not evaluate one message, but a bunch of them, then you want to raise questions about, well, does that really bias the evaluation of any one of the messages when it's in the context of all of these others? We wanted to study that, and we did. But the big issue is validity, because it sounds like this kind of rating process that you might carry out using self-reports and things like, put thoughts in my mind that, this message is convincing, this message is, relevant to issues that matter to me, and so on. may not produce anything that looks like a valid, outcome. So you want to test for the validity of messages, and we certainly did that. And statistically, I won't say anything more about this, but messages get nested in people, people get nested in messages in our designs. That's double nesting, and that's tricky business, and you got to know what you're doing statistically to carry out the analysis of those two random variables with one nested within the other. This slide didn't come out so well, but this represents our attempt to look at the sample size. I tried to get the right version of this and just can't get it, I'm sorry. But what this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 studies, 3 about arguments and texts, 4 about 4 different sets of PSAs related to various topics. And what we have over here on the right-hand side, the figure caption carries it. The top and bottom quartile specification. In other words, you can rank the messages in terms of their scores from top to bottom. And the question is, what happens if you only have a few observations and you want to see what happens to things that were in the bottom quartile moving into the top quartile, or vice versa. And on the one hand, these are really mirror image graphs. One is the case of, this is based on bootstrapping. One is the case where there's misspecification, and the other one is the case in which there's accurate specification, so they're the mirror image of each other. And across the bottom, which again, they can't see very well here, once you get up to about 25 or 30 observations per message, you're good. All right, you got very few misspecifications, very few misspecifications. Now, these are not misspecifications in terms of actual outcomes. These are misspecifications versus the entire sample, which is oftentimes 50, 60, 70 observations. So you don't need that many, and this is a way of telling us we could go small. So about 30 ratings per message were enough for us, and we've followed that in the past. What about if people are evaluating more than one message? And what this graph is, this is for 3 out of 7 studies where we looked at the order specification. Now, the order here is the evaluation of the message if the message appears in the first position, in the second position, in the third position, fourth position, etc. And the worst case was one set of arguments that we actually never used again because there were 12 evaluations done here rather than the usual set of 6. And there were some differences in that one case of the first argument being seen as less effective, less strong than the later versions, than the same argument in later positions, okay? And because we do this by random assignment to position and so on, it's a good measure. And the other measures have very small kinds of differences. It's essentially saying that when you see the message in its initial position, there's more of a likelihood to see it as less effective and as less argumentatively strong. But the size of these effects are very small. The only big version of this is in the first of the 3 argument groupings. So rating a message in the first position in a sequence of messages does not seriously affect its perceived effectiveness or its perceived argument strength versus rating it in other positions. And this is presented in a study by Minji Kim and myself that appeared in Journal of Health Communication recently, a few years ago. But what about the validity of these kinds of measures? And we spent a lot of time with validity. I'm not going to go through a lot of the validity studies. I'm just going to lay out the big effects. Here, I'm particularly interested in objective outcomes because it's too easy to say that this self-report correlates with this other self-report. Okay, that's nice, but it's not particularly convincing. So from a persuasive point of view, we know that messages that are stronger in terms of perceived message effects, that's perceived message effectiveness, that's PME, or perceived argument strength, that's PAS, are more likely to produce heart rate and skin conductance changes in cotinine levels associated with smoking behavior, neural activation in studies by Renee Weber, and even some genetic differences in brain reactivity. We also saw that some of these the messages generated using these self-report kinds of techniques had moderating effects on visual attention, actual visual attention, not visual attention reported, and objective memory, so this is knowledge measures. So, and other kinds of physiological responding from another study by Yahoo Kane. So, it's not, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that perceived message effectiveness and perceived argument strength replace actual message effectiveness or actual argument strength. Can I repeat that? I am not saying that, but what I am saying is that these shortcut tools give us enough information to be able to put a large number of messages into a sort of hierarchy and triage the best and the worst if we want to use best and worst. Best if you want to run a campaign, best versus worst if you want to show that argument strength matters from a theoretical point of view. So, you did not hear me say that these measures of perception replace the gold standard. I didn't say that. I don't mean to imply that, and it isn't true. But if you want to know, it was about 1.5 feet, that'll work. Okay, these will work. And then we did some other things represented by a different kind of approach to message evaluation. And this has to do with, for example, if people get a random selection of messages about tobacco or about drug use, and that means, and it's done randomly across a lot of people. So it's not like, it's a random selection for a group. It's a random selection for each person. So each person is getting a different group from a set of messages. If you take the aggregate effectiveness score for each of those messages, and you summarize the aggregate score for the 4 messages that person got, let that sink in. All right, this is not my evaluation of the messages. This is the fact that I got 4, and their aggregate impact based on the entire sample is the sum of the scores for each of those 4 messages separately. So you get an aggregate impact score. So I say, so what? It's like a mini campaign. Think about this as a way to carry out an analog version of a mini campaign for every single person in your study. And so you give each person in that study then has a score that says they got this much messaging impact, and in terms of the sum of the message scores that they got. Then we look at their behavior or their intention, all right? And we've done that multiple times and found that kind of model works to produce changes in intentions to quit and reduce tobacco consumption. We did it with warning labels from tobacco and showed quit intentions. And I think the most definitive of our studies came out in computational, what is it? CMM, what's it? Not measures, not measures.
Methods and measures?
No. It's the new journal in computational communication science. And we did tailored anti-smoking PSAs, and we had intentions to quit and actually quitting behaviors with these aggregate kinds of scores. So there's good evidence, I think, for saying that messages high in group perceived effectiveness yield behavioral outcomes consistent with actual effectiveness. All right. So I think we have a good case there. Now, remember what I did not say. Everybody got that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Gold standard's not going anywhere. And if I want to do a study of messages of type A versus messages of type B, I'm going to use the gold standard. But if I'm going to pick the messages in the first place, then I'm going to use my efficient techniques to get me there. All right. And so that's what a claim is being made. I think we've gotten some I think interesting substantive findings, and I'll kind of go through these pretty quickly, over and above the fact that we have some efficient tools in our toolbox to evaluate various kinds of messages, textual ones as well as visual ones. Minji Kim did a interesting. All right, so one claim that's common in the communication campaign literature is that demographic similarity between the audience and characters in the message will enhance engagement and effectiveness of those messages. And typically that would mean, you have to pick a particular set of characters, you got to try to match them up. Well, we let that run free because we had 100 different PSAs that have been evaluated by a lot of people, and in some cases there was a match, in some cases there was a mismatch, in other cases there was a partial match. And so we had a natural test, not across a fixed set of messages, but across a random selection of messages that people got. And we found that the presence of characters was crucial, and the demographic similarity worked just fine, thank you very much. Age, race, gender, and smoking status on smoker audience similarity, which enhanced engagement, which in turn was a predictor of message effectiveness. No news there really, because we haven't found something that was sort of unique or wonderful, but boy, I do think it anchors this claim with evidence that's difficult to put aside. We also have been interested in the way different message features operate in accounting for perceived effectiveness. Not as a replacement for actual effectiveness, but because it's a way of being able to carry this study out with a large number of people quickly. And we've done that with about 200 PSAs, about 2,500 smokers, involving 4 exposures to randomly selected anti-smoking messages, and the number of smokers per message was on the average of about 38, 41, 66, 53. It averaged about 47 evaluators per message. And we were interested in the overall responses using 50 different format features. I won't talk about any of those format features except one, because it was a consistent predictor, and that was visual discontinuity. Visual discontinuity in the advertisement. Presence of edits, faces, camera changes, emotion changes, object changes, perspective changes, front of the room, side of the room. Distant, close-ups, and distance movements, number of cuts, formal changes, are all indicators of visual discontinuity. And what we found was that visual continuity or activation was a predictor of effectiveness. Argument strength, bless Cacioppo and Petty, despite the way they measure it and the way they've studied it, argument strength is a consistently strong predictor. Emotional appeals, negative emotional appeals, primarily fear and disgust, are predictors of message effectiveness. And no surprise, narrative, particularly narrative that involves characters. So I can tell you a story, I can show you a story. And if I tell you a story that works, if I tell you and show you that story, even better. Okay, again, across 200 of these PSAs. So this is not a finding, that we got one study here and one study there, but I mean, literally you can say this is from 200 different kinds of messages. And our best example of moving from perceived message effectiveness to actual message effectiveness is the research that we reported not too long ago in computational communication research, in which we did a cloning study of tailored message recommendations to smokers to enhance quit attempts. And this was based on reported reductions in quitting, reported quit attempts, and the consistency over 3 points in time of those set of findings. The other effect that I think that we've produced recently, using some of the models that we've had of message effects, are what I call spillover effects. I think this is a really interesting finding, a little more innovative than some of the other findings that I'm reporting to you here, and that's this. One of the things we know from communication campaigns is that if they're well designed, drug campaign aside, if they're well designed, like the Real Cost campaign has been for youth and tobacco use, they can be pretty effective in reducing the use patterns in tobacco and reducing interest in tobacco for those who are not quite users yet, and ultimately even having some effect on users, and we've seen that. What most of the campaign evaluation work ignores is what happens to other tobacco products. If the campaign is pretty effective on this product, okay, does that take away the need that the person might have be satisfied by some kind of source of nicotine or other way of getting, of being influenced from other sources of tobacco products? The answer is, we don't know. Let's find out. Well, we didn't run such a campaign, but because we were interested in whether, for example, exposure to 6 tobacco, these were not PSAs, these were fixed visuals, 6 tobacco warnings out of some 320 or so that we had, that did have the effect of reducing people's interest in continuing to use tobacco, just as we expected it would. It did. But it also increased interest in hookah, smokeless, and snooze. Didn't have any effect, the direction was the same, didn't have a statistically significant effect on vaping. But it was in the right direction. And the intentions to quit mediated this effect. And you kind of go, whoa. So we've got a campaign that drives tobacco use down, yay, and interest in other tobacco products up. Well, we want to, in subsequent campaigns, all subsequent campaigns, evaluate those things simultaneously to evaluating the core outcome in the campaign. Because there's lots of ways. First of all, the tobacco industry is marvelously adaptive to the audience and changing what is available to deliver their nicotine product. And they are better and faster at that than we are by a long shot. But we should be interested in how the campaign might not change the underlying need, but might seek its satisfaction in other domains. And this is because of using this multiple message model that allows exposure to multiple messages randomly assigned to individuals. All right, so it's a random assignment process. So literally every single person in the study gets a different set of messages. Every single person in the study. Okay, and then we do this aggregation process that I described earlier, and that gives us an analog of a communication campaign per person, each with a different degree of impact. And by the way, if you look at these aggregate scores of exposure to message effectiveness or argument effectiveness, nice normal distribution, which surprised the heck out of me, but it did. Okay, that's the guts of what I have to say. But just a couple of quick other observations. Could go on and on about these things, but I won't. And it has to do with control groups. What do we compare our message effects findings to? What if you compared them to a no message control? You say, okay, well that's good, it's nice and clean and neat and so on. But suppose we had done that in our NIDA studies. One of the things we would find is that message of type A outperformed message of type B, and both of them did worse than a no message control. So you needed the no message control to say that both messages were going in the wrong direction. It's just that one was worse than the other. That was bad. All right. So a no message control is sometimes necessary when you are concerned that your messages might actually all undermine the goals of the campaign. A single message control, you runs into all of the same problems that the single message designs run into. I will tell you a little story. I was working with some neuroscientists, and they said, well, let's use a control message here. And we had some emotional things. I said, so what's the control message? He said, it's a nautical scene. I said, can I see it? And the first thing is, here's this giant shark coming out through the nautical scene. And they said, wait a minute, you're going to use this as the control message? I said, we're going to test emotion as a result of this shark coming through the front of the screen? I said, I don't think that's a good choice. And he said, well, what would you use? And I said, I'd use multiple messages. Oh, we want to use multiple messages and so. But there are some good reasons for using multiple messages for exactly the same reason. There's good reason to use multiple messages if what you're doing is studying fear and efficacy. You'd like to have multiple versions of fear and multiple versions of efficacy. And sometimes that's going to mean you need the no message control plus a message control group, because in the no message control, you can't compare the message effects on the message to a no message. You can project effects on belief or intention or outcome, but not to the message characteristics. So you may need no message control for one reason and a multiple message control for another reason. So you may need multiple control groups. I thank Jeremy Bailenson for that argument. He's done that a number of times in things that he's done, and I think that's quite useful. We've done that on multiple occasions. It's costly, I understand that, but you sometimes have to bite the bullet. And then sometimes we just look at narrative messages versus all of the other messages that don't have narrative in them, and that's the comparison that we do. And those are kinds of control groups. Message manipulations. This is a minor matter that sticks in my craw, and it goes something like this. I'm doing a message study, and in order to do the message study carefully, the first thing I'm going to do is to check that my messages have been correctly perceived. I give people messages, and they're carefully selected, and so on, so on, so on. Then they ask them a whole series of questions about the message. You know, did it have a narrative character to you? Did it seem relevant to you? Did it do this? Did it do that? And I say, oh, that's not a message study anymore. So that's a study of message plus manipulations. You've primed people like crazy. You said, you know what I'm interested in? I'm interested in the narrative and emotional components of this message. Now I'm going to give you my real dependent measures. And I would say, please don't do that, okay? You say, all right, so where are you going to put that? Put it after your dependent measures? But now the dependent measures, behavior, intention, knowledge, and so on, they've all been asked. And now you're going to ask for the manipulation check? Said, so how are you doing? And you just open yourself up to it. So what should you do? Do a different study. Do the manipulation checks over here. Do your message study here. And you say, it's costly, Cappella, you're making us 2 more work. I'm sorry. I apologize. But that's just the way it is. You know, sometimes you just have to do it. The other reason you don't have to do manipulation checks sometimes is that you're doing objective features. Okay? This is a high MSV message defined in this way. You can say, well, did the person perceive it to be a high message effects, a high message sensation value message? Well, if you're interested in that, that's a different study. You're welcome to do that. But you know what? The number of edits in this was 10 per 30 seconds. And in the other case, it was 1 per 30 seconds. And that's the reality. It was there. And if it produced the effect, great. If it didn't produce the effect, too bad. All right? You don't need to check that. It's either there or it's not there. Now, again, if you want to find out something about judgments about manipulation checks, go ahead. What about subjective message components that are not objective, like argument strength? I'm sorry, it's subjective. We don't yet, we can have features of arguments, presence of evidence, presence of this, presence of that. You can, but when push comes to shove, did it put positive thoughts in your mind about the message, or did it reduce negative thoughts in your mind about the behavior? Here we have tended to go to aggregate scores with a separate sample, and that's worked effectively for us. This one I'm just going to wave my hands over in the interests of time. I do think it's an important issue. It's representing something that we're working on right now. We have a paper out under review, and it goes something like this. We're all doing mediational kinds of analyses that are driven by statistical procedures that have come to dominate the way we think about mediation. And you know what? Statistical mediation, theoretical mediation is not causal mediation. I use statistical mediation. I'm sure you use statistical mediation. And you say, there's good reason to believe, and sometimes there is good reason, but most of the time, you really aren't sure. If you really aren't sure, and you're carrying out a study, for example, like we have done with Natural American Spirit cigarettes, where we know that advertising from Natural American Spirit produces false beliefs about those cigarettes, having to do with their safety, their addictiveness, their naturalness, and the presence of constituents. We know they produce false inferences. So it seems like those beliefs, which we know are correlated with intention, but if they're not causes of the intention to use that, and we say, aha, those are the beliefs that we have to change, and they are not causes, then we change things which aren't causes, but in fact effects, and it doesn't work. And you might say, well, you mean you want me to check this over and over and over again? there are gonna be times when you wanna check, because you're investing big money in the mediational components that are the causes that are gonna drive your campaign. If that's the case, then it's time to carry out the kind of what are called parallel encouragement designs, and I'll leave it to you to look at these slides at a later time, and these are them, that lead us to be able to tweak the intervening variable without directly manipulating it. And how we do that is gonna take more time to talk through than we really have at our disposal. Down the line, we're interested in a couple of things right now, and I'll leave you to your questions if we have any remaining time, and that is we are interested in moving from forced exposure, which is what all of our research is about, to selective exposure. We've got to find ways of carrying out selective exposure studies and compare them to forced exposure studies, so in a way that's fair and reasonable and ecologically well designed, so that between selective exposure and forced exposure, we will ascertain whether our forced exposure findings, in fact, are still legitimate in a selective exposure environment. And I mean experimental. I don't mean free flowing. And we've been trying alternative message rating procedures, which I talked to some of you about this morning. And this involves sometimes giving people 7 or 9 messages and saying, all right, here's short ones, not long ones. Say there's 7 or 9 short messages. Which are the ones that are most convincing? Which are the ones most concerning, for example? Which are the ones that are least? So you take 9 and you put them into group of 3, and then the others are in the middle. So you can do 9 times 2 or 9 times 3 messages pretty quickly and come away with some quick measures. We've been doing this with social media commentary about the HPV vaccine, anti-vax commentary, to find the stuff that most concerns people, so that we can look at an inoculation study to debunk those messages before they carry out their pernicious consequences. Finally, I've had the opportunity in the last 2 years to work with the Community Engagement Alliance from the National Institutes of Health, and that's 21 research grants across the country directed at the high disparity consequences of the pandemic in certain communities in the United States. I've been co-directing co-chairing the communications working group for that, and we've developed a paper to look at some of the ways in which messaging is being generated from within the communities. Communities are always participants in message creation in some way, but they are seldom the message creators. And so this is a way to carry out work on messaging that's driven from the community itself. And that's where some of our messaging work is going. I apologize that I have sort of skimmed over all of the kind of substantive stuff that we have been working on for a very long time, and spent some time with these sort of matters, because I thought if any place in the world is going to appreciate some commentary about research methodology, it would be Michigan State.
Yeah.
So thank you for listening, and I don't know if there's any time for chit-chatting, but maybe we can.
There is time for you do have time for questions, and you're all invited to a reception at my house later where you can engage Dr. Capella more. Since I have to get ready for that, I would like to present you with a gift from the department. And we have this silver lapel pin that says Communication Michigan State for you. And now that you're retired, you may want to relax in your communication t-shirt, right? So you're done?
It'll look really good on the beach when I'm fishing.
It absolutely will.
Excellent. I have another t-shirt.
Absolutely.
I hope you got the extra large.
Joe, I wonder if you could comment for a minute about sort of what you feel is the impact of your work on the predominant theory that you're using here, obviously the theory of reason of action and certain components of that. I assume that's sort of the framework you're coming from with your co-authors and so forth. And you've left some of those features of that theory out in terms of driving message impact and so on and so forth. But I mean, sort of maybe generally, theoretically, where do you see your research impacting that domain?
The theoretical
Yeah.
side of things. So, what,
Yeah.
in terms of content choices in communication campaigns, that work that is based on some important stuff that Hornick and Wolf have done, and that's been adopted by the FDA in their Real Cause campaign. And did I lose that?
Lost it, yeah, sorry.
Oh, my goodness. Did you do that to me?
No, I didn't decide. Sorry, thank you.
They used the model that basically said beliefs are the mediators between intention and,
Yes.
and other things.
Right.
Okay, so that work has been very important, and it has been consequential to the design of communication campaigns. But this last stuff I talked about here on receiving parallel encouragement designs says if these beliefs are not causal mediators between external kind of messaging on the one hand and intention and behavior on the other hand, we're barking up the wrong tree. Okay? And one of the things that has been been interesting to me is to watch the FDA jump right into that with Hornick and Wolf, and Real Cost worked pretty successfully. But when we tried to do this in the city of Philadelphia for an anti-smoking campaign there, that campaign failed miserably. Not because of Hornick, I'm not blaming Hornick and Wolf, they were still using sort of the right kind of model. So that's one domain in which I think we need to be careful about causal mediation, and rather than just covariation. The other is that I think that, and I've written about this, and I have a paper that's sitting there that's not really ever gone out for review, that is about the ELM and how to extend the ELM to some of these feature characteristics. We know the role of argument strength in that theory. It's pretty straightforward and it's clear. But what's less clear are how these other kinds of features, whether they're MSV features or whether they are narrative features and so on, would operate in that model. And I think they operate through ability and motivation. Because if you start thinking about these features, such as narrative character. Well, narrative character should help with involvement, okay? So that should drive up motivation to some extent. And also ability, because telling the story rather than presenting a big bunch of statistics can have those kinds of, so you have an ability motivation effect in the messaging and tracing that. So those are the ways in which that I think the stuff that we've been working on is consequential to the two theories that I think are most important to message effects. One is the reasoned action model on the one hand, which deals with content, and the elaboration likelihood model, which deals with processing.
Have you written that up at all? I mean,
It's written.
It's just not up.
No, I was supposed to go to somebody and they didn't like it. And I thought with them for a while, and I said, you asked for this and this is what I gave you, and they said, we want you to change all of the following things. I said, no. And so I was supposed to send it out and somewhere else. And
Hold your ground, Joe. Don't.
yeah, but guess what? It's sitting in a box, So,
Thank you.
anyway, that one's written up.
Good. Well, ask another one.
No, I think that one is
Okay,
all
good.
I was curious, I think it was about your fifth point, and I'm guilty of this. I always ask people their perceptions of messages on many dimensions that we are trying to manipulate, things like that. But I'm wondering, and I think this is really interesting, of course, from these mass communications, but one of the ways I'm trying to think about maybe the way that we get health messages is from like interpersonal. So asking maybe about like, what was the perceived argument strength, or maybe the ways that you were talking about doing a study, like a pre-test to understand and like match different like message characteristics on. So thinking about it from like an interpersonal, do you think that asking them, about like say self-report a message you got in this conversation or something about like health, and then asking them, was this like high sensation, was this, did you have counter arguing, did you have maybe all these effects? do you think that's effective, or do you think it would still have the same thing where you could just maybe take some of those messages that people reported in their interpersonal conversation and then asking a different group about that? Like, do you think your ideas about the mass communication also apply in other characteristics?
So are interpersonal messages persuasive? Is that what you're asking about? And is there different ways of testing that? Is that kind of what you're driving at?
Now let me try to rephrase. Sorry, my question was very long. But I think that, like, in terms of kind of doing this types of like pre-survey to check different message characteristics, makes a lot of sense for these like mass messages that we're sending out to like large groups. But I don't know if that type of like knowing, if I see a certain message that I would think for what I study would be like a face-threatening message. If I feel like I'm missing something if I don't specifically ask that person or each person if for them that was a face-threatening message and getting
Sure,
those
yeah, I see what you're
measures.
saying, yeah, I mean, are there sort of universal face-threatening messages, or is there too much variation in it? So I think that's actually an interesting question, and you can ask that question about, various kinds of messages of different sorts in the interpersonal domain. And it has to do with whether you have a message-based effect, a person effect, or really the interaction between the two. And part of what we did at some point with our work is we did some partitioning of the variance of that kind, where for text-based messages that were arguments, and found mostly more universal kinds of effects, fewer effects that were due to the interaction between the message characteristics and the person characteristics. But, that wasn't necessarily a message that was about, our relationship. So those kinds of messages might have to be highly idiosyncratic in terms of their impact. But on the other hand, I can think of a variety of interpersonal messages which are gonna tick people off regardless of who they are. So, there's always individual difference. One of the studies that we've done that I really, really like, and it's a very complicated study, is our message cloning study. I call this study social influence without social interaction. And what it is a study in which the analog is messaging that you would carry that would be analogous to movie choices on Netflix. So the model is, you go into your Netflix account and you start picking out, Netflix shows that you watch. And so Netflix is keeping track of that, all right? And then Netflix finds somebody who, usually several people, who choose those shows, all right? And they choose other shows that you haven't chosen. And then they come back to you and say, we think you might like these other shows. And you say, how did you know I might like these shows? And the answer is because, they don't tell you this, because we found a clone of you in terms of choice of shows. And that clone of you, in terms of the shows that they chose, okay, also chose these other shows. And so, in all likelihood, because of that behavioral similarity between the two of you, what worked for that guy is going to work for you too. All right. Now, if they have ratings about the shows from that person, even better. We did exactly that with messages. With messages, and we had people rate like seven messages. And so, once we had those ratings, we knew some of the messages that they liked and some of the messages that they didn't like. And we used that as the basis of finding clones of them. People who had those same 7 messages in our data set that, liked the ones that this guy liked and didn't like the ones that this guy liked. And then we found the other messages that person liked, and we said, this person's gonna like those messages too. And that's what we get, that's what we gave them. And now there, the control group is really tricky, because what's the control group? So we did a very conservative control group. Comparison group was to messages that scored highest across the sample, not by person, but across the entire sample. And so if you could get an improvement from this social influence without social interaction, these cloned messages, then you really have something. And we got it. Yeah. Tricky to do, but interesting.
Yeah.
Quick question, why do you think it is that most social science, many social science disciplines unquestionably use mediational analysis in the sort of simple way you've described, where you do the analysis and draw some strong causal inferences, when in fact there are lots of people out there who dug into this quite a bit and say that this is a tool that's got lots of flaws and lots of assumptions have to be made. Any of these assumptions being violated will undermine this inference. Why, given that the experts are so familiar with the limitations, is it the case that the general public and the editors and the readers are not?
So I think what happened historically is, the classic business of new tools in the toolbox. And so when
Baron and Kenny.
well, but Baron and Kenny, they pointed out all the problems way back when. But then Hayes at Ohio State and his co-conspirators developed this terrific bit of software and tools and argued for, how you still might get mediation even though you don't see any obvious indications of it, a la Baron and Kenny. And so everybody jumped into that. And I did too. I've used statistical mediation. I even, presented some of that here, and the first thing you should say to me is, Cappella, what are you doing? I don't think it's fair to ask us to always look for causal mediation, but there are contexts where you're going to spend a lot of money based on the causal mediation, and there is good reason to doubt the causal mediation, the statistical mediation, and therefore you want to carry out the next piece of work to ensure that the mediation is causal and not merely statistical or theoretical. Now I had a reviewer who will remain nameless, all right, when we sent them this paper, rejected the paper out of hand and said, we know that structural equation modeling and a good theory will do everything that you want it, that you say it won't do. And I bit my tongue, but what I wanted to do was to say, that's going to be great news to the FDA, because it's going to mean that they never have to carry out any clinical trials anymore. They just have to show covariation between, taking the pills and outcomes in terms of disease. But I didn't do that because I figured I might want to submit to that journal again in the future. So my answer is a tool. The tool became easy to use, software was there, and it got answers to questions that everybody knew were not quite sufficient. And now there have been several articles, really well-crafted articles, doing the whole thing from Baron and Kenny all the way through parallel encouragement signs and a bunch of other things out of the psych literature.
Is that making its way into the stat classes?
That I don't know. I'm emeritus now. What do I know about stat classes?
Somebody here must be still doing it.
Questions, yeah.
So you mentioned like golden standards, and you also mentioned other measures other than golden standards, like perceived self-reports. I want to just take one step ahead and then ask, what do you think are the important questions that all these new methods and can help us answer? Because I read some papers that you published using very new methods, and you also made some reviews about misinformation. You proposed that there are many questions about correcting misinformation, and we may have overlooked their long-term effect. So these questions seem a bit difficult to study using, or quite expensive to study using traditional methods. So what new opportunities, theoretical opportunities, do you think the new methods will bring to us?
Well, obviously we don't know let's take misinformation about COVID. We may as well, bite the bullet, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, etc. Mixed metaphors. I mean, we really don't know. As Francis Collins, the retired head of the National Institute of Health said, we know a lot about how to control disease. We know a lot about how to create vaccines. We don't know how, we don't have the good data, the good evidence to get people to accept our recommendations about disease. So we don't know how to handle the kind of core questions that we've been asking about persuasion for a very long time. But there's certainly no doubt that what will happen in the very near future, I think, is an outpouring of money from the National Institutes of Health that will be directed at exactly the kinds of questions that they wished and we wished we had answers to. Doesn't mean they're gonna find the answers, but that they're going to spend money to try to get the answers to how to best present information that will be effective in reducing the impact of misinformation. Obviously, misinformation has real psychological and sociological value for people, and so understanding how and why that misinformation has that value, and how to monitor for it on a regular basis, which we don't do well enough. Okay, we're doing it now, but we're not doing it well enough. And responding to it quickly before it becomes entrenched, in the society. Those are not good answers to your question, but they are sort of the core questions that a lot of us and you will have to address. You can say, what about inoculation? Pre-bunking versus debunking. That's a step in the right direction, but timing is crucial. Once something becomes deeply entrenched, you can't inoculate somebody against something that's deeply entrenched. So you got to get to folks early in that regard. Anyway, not a good answer, but
Thank you.
that's part of what is the challenge for a lot of us, all of us.
Other questions? I took over from Monique just for a minute. Other questions? Yeah.
I think very practical question. So, Professor, you said that, in terms of message design, formatting components cannot be pulled apart from the content component. So, if this is the case, how we design the message when we make a kind of research, because if it is inherent characteristic of media, we cannot separate the format and the content, so one by one. So it could be very tricky process to make more reliable, valid materials for experimental design. Because if we choose this content for this format, this content already embedded some kind of component of format. So if we cannot separate these two different classes, it could be hard to disentangle which component to make this effect.
So you can always design a message from the ground up in any way that you want. In the work that we've done, we've tended to use messages that exist in the world. And so while we can separate out the content from those messages from the rest of the message, we can't pull the characters out,
Right.
We can't change the tone of voice, even though we know how to do that, it turns out. There are a lot of things that we can't change, but that's not the issue. The issue is to say, given a large archive of messages that have characteristics that happen to co-vary. For example, guess what? Characters and narrative co-vary. Can you have a narrative without characters? It's almost impossible to tell a story that's not about people. Now you can tell a story about dogs, you can tell a story about other things, but those are characters, all right?
Right.
So it's almost impossible to have a narrative without characters. But there are some, because people just tell a story. Now that's the storyteller. He's not necessarily a character. So some features naturally covary and can't be pulled apart. But once you know certain things, if you know that discontinuity has consequences, especially in the extreme, if you know narrative has positive consequences, if you know characters have positive consequences, if you know emotions of fear and disgust have consequences, if you know efficacy matters, if you know X, Y, Z, and Q, those are some principles that you can take advantage of in message design, okay? In building new messages, not in trying to revamp existing messages. But that's what we tend to use, messages that are in the world. And we do that because of ecological validity and because of the cost of creating large numbers of messages. And thanks be to God, we have access to a lot of that stuff. I mean, there are people who build these archives all the time. And in social media, there's a ton of it. In classic media, there are a ton of messages of all sorts. So there's stuff there. That is not the issue. Okay. The issue is really what are the substantive questions that you want to ask and answer.
So I have a quick question.
Sure.
So you talked about having an efficient way to test a lot of messages.
Yes.
And I was just curious about your thoughts on AI and machine learning and how that might influence and the evolutions of these types of studies, where now you can have kind of adaptive messages that can change by person fairly cost effectively, right?
So I've read some of the programming and some of the articles that are written with the title "An Automatic System for Generating Arguments." And when I read these pieces, I go, "You must be kidding." There's almost nothing that looks anything like any argument that I've ever seen. Can they generate things that look like propositions? Yep. Do they know to put in exemplars? No. Why don't they put in exemplars? Because I've never heard of exemplars. Okay, what the heck are exemplars anyway? Well, they're stories, little quotes from individual human beings. Mary Jones, mother of two, smoked her entire life. And by the time she reached age 48, she had emphysema. And she had the task of talking to her children. Well, I'm sorry, AI hasn't done that. Is it capable of doing it? I have no doubt. At some point, we're going to see great contributions in that arena. So, can AI generate propositions? Sure. And can it learn to generate propositions? Yes. And how does it do that? And generally by going online and pulling up a whole bunch of propositions on a topic and seeing which 2, 3, 4, 5 word sequences occur with high probability, and then they start training to locate more of those kinds of examples. Still doesn't tell you which ones work. Now, what about metadata that's in some of the social media stuff that could possibly be an indicator of the effectiveness of those messages? The answer there, I think, is for certain kinds of metadata like transmissibility, and so on. That's pretty interesting. But things like liking and comments, that can go in both directions simultaneously. We know what liking can do. I like this because it is so absurd. I'm gonna take joy out of sending this to friends of mine, and we're gonna laugh about it, behind people's backs. And so liking has never been a good indicator of and same with commentary. Unless you start evaluating the comments, in which case you might say, this speaks to exactly what I want it to speak to. Now you know that they've accepted the message. If you can do that, then you can start weighting those messages by transmissibility. There's a reach, some indication of acceptance, some attempt to accept the framing of the issue. Have I done this? No. But have I thought about it? I have, because I work with computer scientists on a fairly regular basis. And we would love to be able to tap into what I know I've mentioned to a couple of you in here, opinion dynamics. And right now, to tap into opinion dynamics online in the social media world, it gets us a long ways, but once we hit the question of acceptance, all right, of the information, we have to go outside of the system, either to archival data, say, oh, guess what, in these media markets, the acceptance of the vaccine was at this level, and so now you're no longer assessing whether a particular argument is effective or ineffective. What you're doing is you're assessing whether the argumentative structure that was circulating among the people in that media market can be tied somehow to the levels of vaccination in that media market in contrast to others. So you've got to go outside the system. I think it's a really interesting question to ask. Can AI generate arguments? But there's another interesting question that I'm personally more interested in, and that is, can we find techniques, tricks, shortcuts that will give us purchase on the acceptance of an online transmission? So when you have that, please send it on. I appreciate it.
You'd be the one.
Oh, good, great, I'm talking to the right person
Yeah.
now. Yeah. He's
Well-
probably thought about all this already, and because
Maybe.
I know how to do this.
All right, well, if we can give a big round of applause and
Thank
thank
you. Yesterday, I walked across campus, and I'd forgotten how beautiful this campus is. And walked over to Kedzie Hall, which is where I spent a lot of time, over 4 years of time. And I finally recognized Kedzie Hall. And the only other thing I recognized, really, in my heart of hearts, was the parking garage next to it. Why that should be, I have no idea. But I remember that. And the student union, not so much, but Kedzie Hall and parking garage.
Well, thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
So, you know what I was thinking about, one of your slides was Q-swords.